Good afternoon, everyone. It's finally the afternoon here, even on the West Coast. So as our Datamark Virtual Public Safety Conference pulls into the train station destination, we're going to wrap up here with, although this isn't the last presentation, I'm going to wrap up my involvement with it. I think Bob and Annie will as well with this session, Best Practices for Implementing a GIS Strategic Plan for Next-Gen 911. As with the rest of the sessions, we're going to keep everybody's mics muted, but we're going to be monitoring the Q&A. So please, we want this to be conversational as much as possible. Use that Q&A to ask questions, make comments, and share what your reactions are to what we're sharing with you guys today. So our presenters today are Annie Cahill, our Public Safety GIS Technical Manager based out of Virginia, and Bob Murphy, our Public Safety Subject Matter Expert based out of Florida. Thanks for joining us, guys. We look forward to the show today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Bob. Thank you guys, everyone, for being with us. As Jeff mentioned, I'm Annie Cahill. I am a technical manager with Datamark, and I've been working in local government GIS for the last 15 years before coming to Datamark. And one of the things that I do on a regular basis is I go into different localities and I work with them to generate strategic plans, and we create them together, and I make sure that that we're really working together to determine the goals and all of the different stakeholders, bringing everyone to the table. And Bob and I have really worked closely together with a lot of our clients in Florida.
Yeah, thanks, Annie, and to everybody joining. Looks like we have great numbers for this session. So thank you all for taking time on a Friday afternoon to join us. As Jeff and Annie indicated, my name is Bob Murphy. I have the distinct pleasure to work with so many incredible folks at the Datamark team here. Annie being one of my biggest fans. As Annie indicated, we have had the pleasure to work just a number of projects in Florida with honestly some of the best people I've ever had the pleasure of working with on the public safety and GIS side. And I think a lot of folks are wondering, why is this 911 guy sitting in on a conversation about NG9-1-1 GIS strategic planning? And it's an interesting concept because we're going to switch hats a little bit here, and hopefully from the public safety perspective, I can help guide some of that conversation. But I've had the opportunity to learn and work with some incredible GIS professionals, not only in Datamark, but my experiences in both PSAPs and both counties that I've worked with. I've just learned a ton, really from those folks. So hopefully I can share that with y'all.
Okay, so just wanted to discuss the goals briefly that we have for today's session. So we definitely want to talk about the changes that NG9-1 is bringing to how you create your strategic plans for GIS. There's a lot of changes, and it's going to affect everyone, as we'll learn in this session. We're also going to talk about ways to eliminate roadblocks, certain things that you need to take into consideration when you are designing your strategic plan. We're going to talk about the importance of defining those roles for your stakeholders and the importance of collaboration. We're going to talk about the ways that your workflows are going to change in Next-Gen 911, and also explain, of course, the GIS component with the data quality, completeness, maintenance, and accuracy. And then, of course, kind of talk about the next steps after you've gathered all of your information.
Great. So what changes, from a strategic plan perspective, what's changing in a GIS strategic plan? Why is it that we put together this working session to talk about GIS strategic plans specifically? And the first thing I want to throw out there to everybody is, from a public safety perspective, we have downvalued GIS practitioners. And I say this all the time. I see this in folks from Okaloosa County GIS on the session. And hopefully you guys have heard me say this before. We've never valued just how much you bring to the table. and you have these incredible strategic plans, and you do such incredible things. Your data is so, and most times data tells a story and is so good. But as we make this transition to next generation 911, it really cultivates a new challenge for everybody. It cultivates a challenge and introduces a challenge for GIS practitioners. It cultivates and introduces a challenge to public safety professionals, because we have to take a very different approach to how we're going to move forward with this. And hopefully this introduces, we can introduce some of those concepts to you as we kind of move through this slide deck here in this conversation. And as Jeff alluded to earlier, the question and answer session, please folks, by all means, load us up with some questions, challenge our thoughts and opinions here, and let us dig deep into this for you. We've got an hour with you, and we want to make this as successful as we can for each of you.
So successful strategic planning has many facets. I would say the most important is education. A big part of the strategic planning process is identifying and getting all of your stakeholders to the table. Okay, but as Bob just mentioned, it's going to be changing a lot of our workflows. Okay, so it's kind of difficult to approach a stakeholder and say, okay, well, you've been doing something this way for 30 years, and now we just need you to go ahead and change what you're doing. And, everyone loves change, so that's a real easy task, right? So one of the things that we found to be very beneficial is actually educating our stakeholders. It's very beneficial for them to understand the importance of Next Gen 911 and why their workflows have to change, instead of just saying, hey, you got to do this. One example I like to give is municipalities. A lot of our localities have smaller municipalities who are responsible for assigning their own addresses. And one of the biggest things that we find is there's a gap in communication between the municipality and getting that information back to the locality. And that seems to be ubiquitous almost in every state in which I've worked. And one of the things that we do is we will oftentimes interview the municipalities to get a sense of what their workflow is. But before we get into the interview process, we like to explain to them, hey, here's what Next Gen is, here's why it's important, and here's why you guys really need to come together and talk about this. Did you have any more comments about the educational component, Bob? Because you do this. This is one of your main things.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing, so, it's kind of hard because we're not using the chat function but, kind of thinking silently, how many folks, especially in the GIS community, haven't heard about have heard about NG911, but nobody's ever taken the opportunity to say how that's going to impact them. There are, unfortunately, and again, going back to, I said this before, we've not appreciated the GIS practitioners' involvement to that is, when we think about NG911 from a public safety perspective, we just assume, and we shouldn't assume, but we blindly assume that our partners in GIS just have this deep understanding of what that means for them. And we do a poor job. And I say that coming from the public safety perspective. We do a very poor job most times of really explaining our needs and how they impact others, because well, for 100 years, we expect that we're the most important people because we answer 911 calls and we dispatch field responders, and that everybody should be at our beck and call. And so when we call over to our GIS folks and say, hey, we need this map updated because we're not educated ourselves, we just assume that everybody's a cartographer, right? And they make maps, and that couldn't be further from the truth. So we spend a lot of time educating not only the GIS folks on how that's going to impact them, but educating the public safety folks of how they can't just expect the GIS folks to flip the switch, drop everything they're doing for the Board of County Commissioners and the other divisions in which they support, and make 911 their sole focus.
Yeah, and I also would like to comment that, GIS people, like most everyone out there who works in local government, we wear different hats, right? We're oftentimes supporting not only public safety, but public works, supporting planning department needs, things like that. So one of the things from my perspective is maybe a way to foster that understanding is maybe to invite your GIS people into your PSAP. Invite them in and help them understand how things work on that end of things, because that was something that I always felt was a really big disconnect for me when I worked in local government. Yes, I was managing the 911 system addresses and road center lines, but I wasn't really sure how it was being used on the other side. So that's just something to consider. And similarly for GIS people, invite your public safety folks into GIS. Maybe sit with them and show them how you edit data, show them what your processes are. That way you guys can learn from each other and find new ways to collaborate and communicate. Which brings me to my next point. Did my slide lock up? There we go. Communication. Communication is incredibly important, and it's one of those fundamental things that a lot of people get wrong. I think there's a lot of assumptions that are made oftentimes, and in the work that we do with different localities, we often find that regarding the issues with the workflows, a lot of it revolves around breakdowns in communication. Oftentimes, we go to localities and they're missing huge chunks of addresses that they just haven't received from someone else because the information wasn't communicated properly. So communication is incredibly important for developing a successful strategic plan and meeting those goals. Collaboration. Going back to my municipality example, how going forward, if you recognize a problem with the workflow between how information is communicated from your municipalities back to the locality, how can we work together to kind of correct that situation? So maybe it involves a ticketing system. Maybe it involves an email that goes out every week or every month, or how often people are assigning addresses. It involves collaboration to find the best solution that works for both parties. And then clearly define goals. Every plan has to have goals. And Bob, since you work a lot with the state of Florida, would you like to remark on how important it is to keep state goals in mind when you're doing strategic planning? I know some states are more involved in next gen than others, so can you kind of comment about that?
Yeah, you know, and this kind of goes back to really the first introduction there of the education is, especially in strategic planning, you know, we have a tendency, and I say that we as an industry have a tendency to start looking at the operations within our own department. And when you build those strategic plans, you've got to look outside the box. We did a presentation yesterday. I had opportunities to co-present a presentation with Joby Smith from Baldwin County, Alabama. And we talked about how we started kind of working in a region. You know, we started looking outside of the county, and that's incredibly important, especially in an NG9-1 environment. But when you just with that, the state of Florida as an example, amongst many others, and that's just an example, Alabama, Kansas, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, there's a plethora of states that are looking at this NG9-1 transition at a very statewide level. So you want to be plugged in there. And for the folks on this call, from a GIS perspective, a lot of times that information doesn't make it across the aisle to you. So I'm kind of looking directly at you folks is reach over to the PSAP director. If they haven't reached out to you yet, reach over to them and say, what is happening at the county level? What is happening at the state level? You got to be plugged into there, because what we're going to see here in a couple of slides later, your data is going to move. It's going to move just from the locality perspective, and it's going to move all the way up to the state level, and sometimes you know, either a interstate or intrastate use. So you want to be heavily involved in that to kind of see what's coming down the pipe, so that, you know, what we as public safety folks don't do is call you on Friday and say, we need you to be ready for this on Monday. And I'll throw a shade at myself that we've done that. And I know the folks on, again, talk to the Okaloosa folks. I've called you on Tuesday and said, hey, I need something on Thursday. But you've moved mountains, and you got it there, and you've got it done for us before. But you know, we don't want to put you in that position again. So some folks love this slide, some folks hate this slide, but I think these two pictures sum up successful strategic planning, especially as we talk about NG911 and NG9-1-1 GIS. So you see two pictures here, and we talk about this quite often. The picture on the left is a picture of 6 or 8 silos, and those silos represent how we operate today. Public safety operates in a public safety silo where we're only concerned about public safety initiatives. GIS operates in a GIS silo, and they're focusing on data to support the process they need. Now, inherently, and Andy talked about this a little bit ago, the GIS folks, you guys tend to work more collaboratively with other departments because you're supporting multiple business processes. But addressing, planning, land development, growth management, public safety, transportation, all these different individuals have a goal to meet their own business needs. So we operate within that silo. But as we move to NG911, we've got to start looking to the right here, and that's operating in crosswalks, where before we step in traffic, when we think about when we teach our kids how to cross the street, you got to look both ways. We're looking both ways for cars in an NG911 environment of how we're going to build strategic plans. We've got to look both ways to see how our actions and our plans are going to potentially put us in front of a bus to get run over by somebody else, right? So we have to build that collaboration and cooperation amongst other divisions. From a data mark perspective, we pride ourselves on education. We do a lot of education because we believe in that. Regardless of what path you choose, we want to provide you with the information that we believe is standards-based and is proven so that you can be successful. And when we talk about these educational opportunities, all too often do we bring folks in the room, and it's the first time that we've introduced the 911 director to the addressing authority. A lot of times we say, who signs your addresses? Somebody over in this office, somebody over in that office. I don't know, I send an email to them and they give me an address, 3 days later. Who's maintaining your GIS data? Somebody over in the GIS office. Those aren't the times that we want to introduce folks to one another. And I also say this in our presentations quite often. From a public safety perspective, find the GIS manager, find the addressing manager, and they've got to become your best friend. We're going to become best friends. It's kind of like, for those of you who follow Will Ferrell, Step Brothers, it's kind of the analogy of, did we just become best friends? You better believe we did, right? Because we're in this together. I see Jeff's cracking up because we talk about this internally, right? We're going to become best friends with one another because we cannot do this together. So, as we kind of move forward, the next slide's probably going to show you why this transition is happening and how we want to start thinking when we start thinking about planning. So, I want you to think about the network of networks. Think about the Internet of Things. Think about the cell phone that is sitting next to you somewhere on your desk. It's connected to everything. It's connected to this webinar. It's connected to the internet. It's connected to the wireless network around you. And when we look and think about NG911, we're talking about building networks of networks. And to do that, it takes collaboration. To do that, it takes cooperation between agencies that typically don't work with one another. So in these interconnected systems, we're going to serve as redundant backups and cross connect our data. So when we look at this diagram that's in front of you right now, this is how we sit today. We store our networks, we store our data, we operate at a very sub-regional and a local level. As we start expanding NG911, we move and we're going to expand. So the next thing that we're going to do is start looking regionally. I want to start sharing my network with my neighbors to the west and to the east of us, to the north to the south, right? I want to build a regional EZNet, or emergency services IP network. I'm going to then take my data and I'm going to roll my data to the state level. For all of those folks on the call that are working in a state or an environment where the state's going to start moving forward these initiatives, the data is going to move from the local level that you're storing in the county. You're going to roll it on up to a regional level. You're going to re-aggregate the data. You're going to validate data at that level. And then you need to roll to the state level. Should it stop there? Let's think about AT&T and Verizon and these big networks that are provisioning wireless and nationwide EZNets and nationwide systems. Should it stop at the state level? Right? Because how many of us on this call border another state? I look into some of the names here that are attending. I know you guys have borders with other states. We're going to have to start sharing outside of our state to bordering states, sometimes in some cases 3 or 4 states, and then move that one step further. What if you border Mexico or you border Canada? What does that look like? Should we just stop sharing data and stop sharing a network just because we move between a county to a state or to a country? That's kind of what's happening with NG9-1. That's kind of the envisionment, that we can build these networks of networks of networks and start sharing data over. So we're going to provision that spatial data and roll it up to each level, right? Now, I mean, candidly, currently as we talk, we're talking for the most part, you know, at the regional, sub-regional, local level, regional, and the state level, but we can fully expect this thing to continue to expand as we expand our abilities. So that brings in probably the most important piece to this is, as that data is rolled up to those individual networks and shared with other folks, how are we going to manage our data, right? What's our data maintenance look like, right? It's going to have multiple levels of aggregation, multiple levels of validation checks. So, you know, thinking about that from a strategic perspective, are you in a position to do that? Do you have workflows and process to support that? So that's kind of the overview of where we're at and where we're heading, right? We're going to blossom, and you kind of look at this thing kind of like an onion, right? We're peeling the layers of onion back, and we're going to get all the way to the center of that and kind of get that all squared away before we can start rolling it up.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, Bob. So you can kind of think of the big picture goals and then kind of work backwards, right? So that involves setting your goals and then kind of working backwards and saying, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that we can achieve this together as an organization? So the strategic plan process has many different facets. The first thing that we need to do is identify who our stakeholders are. Stakeholders are coming from a number of different departments. They have a lot of different roles and responsibilities, and it's very unlike what you see today. We're not operating in silos. We're all working together for a common goal. So that's going to involve bringing together different people to the table who may not have worked together previously. The other thing we need to do is gather information. And there are several different ways that you can do this. You can publish surveys. You can also have meetings or in-person interviews or web interviews, whatever works the best for you. And in this information gathering, we need to find out all different types of information. We need to identify the roles and responsibilities for each person, because one of the things that we like to do is we like to find out who's doing what, because sometimes people are doing more than what they can handle. And a lot of times addressing kind of takes a back seat to the rest of the roles and responsibilities. So that person may not be prioritizing that task, and thus things might fall through the cracks, or things might not be done according to the best standards for supporting 911. So we need to find out who's doing what in the organization, and if they're overwhelmed, what their desires are as far as maybe increased staffing. A lot of people, especially if they're working in the planning department, they'll say, you know, I'm the floodplain manager. I'm also doing X, Y, and Z, and we really should have someone who is a specific public safety GIS person. And so that's something that you might want to consider in your plan. So roles and responsibilities, identifying that, incredibly important. The next thing you want to do is also, when you talk to your GIS people, or if the GIS people, if you're leading the strategic planning process, you need to have a thorough understanding of your technical environment. And this is where you might want to leverage your IT staff. So you want to find out what kind of servers you have in place, kind of do a software inventory, determine if there's any third-party software that you might be using to help you manage your GIS data. Is there anything that you would desire that would help you manage it better? All of that is incredibly important for understanding the technical infrastructure. Another thing is the workflows. What is the workflow for an address? How does an address become an address? From the moment that the request is initiated all the way up through the time that it's entered into GIS, the time that it's provisioned into public safety systems, and the time that it may at some point be recognized as a discrepancy. What does that process look like? You need to have a very thorough understanding of those workflows. How is data being provisioned to different systems, especially into your public safety systems? You really just cannot have too much information in this phase. The data quality, we have a whole other discussion about data quality, but you have to have a good baseline understanding of what your data quality looks like. And then some other things you might want to consider are the technical expertise of your staff. You might want to consider training for those staff if you find that the technical expertise isn't where it needs to be. And then what you could do is basically from your baseline assessment, you can determine your deficiencies and what your needs are. And of course, you can have a plan going forward with next steps. So, Bob, do you want to speak to the public safety stakeholders part of this?
Sure, absolutely. So kind of, as we indicated earlier, you start putting together this plan. I'm sorry, just looking at a question that just came in from Brian about staffing succession planning. Yeah, we're going to talk about that here just in a little bit. You know, identifying stakeholders, as we said earlier, and probably the second slide, this changes, right? I mean, because all these different folks, when we look at this representation here, this really represents who our public safety stakeholders are right now. I mean, it's traditionally it's 911 from the call handling perspective, your fire departments, your EMS agencies, your law enforcement. But as we start looking at what NG9-1-1 really entails, so as we're start developing these strategic plans, here's the big shift, right? So if we advance one more, we start to see we're adding some folks in that that we haven't played with before, right? So here's the big shift. This is the big realignment. It starts to add, you can kind of see at the bottom there, it adds the who the public safety stakeholders are really in each locality. We're talking all these individuals that typically have not been part of the 911 process are now critical to the 911 process. You know, we go back, and this is outside the GIS element, but we go back to an NG9-1 developing an EZNet, you know, an emergency services IP network. IT becomes critical to that. We can't move forward with that. Public works and planning, how often do we talk to those folks now, right? We don't talk to them all that often. We talk to GIS because we want to get some data out of them to support our CAD maps and our call handling maps. But it really cultivates and really just broadens the stakeholder engagement of who's really important, you know. And unfortunately for others, you're being kind of cusped into this thing and you've never had exposure to it. So this goes back to the education component, is we have to educate. You know, we do these strategic planning meetings with some of our clients, and it's funny because they say, you know, who should we invite to the strategic planning meeting? And we give them this list of, you know, public works and planning and IT and code enforcement and the fire departments and so on and so forth. And our customers do a great job. They send out this email, hey, we're working on this next generation 911 project, and we're going to do this kickoff meeting. We want you to come to this meeting with us. And the first thing that typically planning and public works says is, well, why do we need to be there? We have nothing to do with 911.
Yep. And
they didn't in the past, but in NG9-1 they do. So we've got to get them caught up to that, right? I mean, we're talking about addressing, right? And what you don't see here is you don't see addressing. And I want to throw the disclaimer out there is that we're making the assumption that addressing is going to fall typically within one of these departments, whether they be 911 or public works or planning. You know, and GIS is becoming an increasingly popular department for addressing to fall into. You know, all these things, all these folks are touched by that, right? So we have to do a good job of getting folks in there. And as we move into this NG9-1 environment, it really advances and expands our stakeholders, which is challenging for us. So, you know, identifying that during a strategic plan of who's going to be part of that process, and, you know, how do you support that at your local level, your county level, and then again, how are you supporting those statewide or regional initiatives? This stakeholder engagement list is going to expand further and further and further and further. So just the kind of a highlight there. These are really the folks that are there. It's kind of funny because as the who shook, I shook, right? But again, just highlights who's just so incredibly important to us.
So as we talked about earlier, the information gathering stage is extremely important for a strategic plan. You really need to know what you're working with now and get a good baseline assessment before you can determine what your next steps are going to be. So really, the diagram on the right is a very oversimplified diagram of a addressing workflow. So I mentioned earlier that we really need to have a full understanding of that workflow from the time that the address request is initiated to the time that it is assigned, to the time that it gets entered into GIS and then notified to different agencies, when it's provisioned into different public safety systems, and then we need to have a full understanding of the discrepancy process. Again, that's a very oversimplified diagram because there's so much more that goes into an addressing workflow than what you see here. A lot of times, and I think Jeff and I might have talked about this on Monday, we see a lot of localities that have very old addressing systems. A lot of times they just say, look, we were a grid-based system, but we don't even know where the grid is now. It was like some old piece of paper and it got lost a long time ago. So what we just do is kind of interpolate an address based on its location. And that's very common. So you might want to consider understanding that workflow of how you assign an address, not just we assign it. Okay, well, what do you do to assign the address? What type of information do you need before you can assign that address? Road center lines, also very important. What does that process look like? Do you have an ordinance, or do you have something in place that says if 3 or more structures share a right-of-way, that right-of-way needs to have a road name? Do you allow for directionals? Do you allow duplicates? Do you have a process by which you are comparing a new road name with existing road names in your system to ensure that there's no duplicates? All of these things are incredibly important. You also want to understand that full workflow with public safety. How does that GIS data get provisioned into public safety systems? That's very, very important. Not only how, but how often. That is one of the most important things that we ask so many questions about, is that life cycle of how your GIS data gets provisioned into public safety systems. Municipalities, if you are a locality who has several municipalities who may do their own addressing, but you're responsible for showing that addressing in GIS, what does that workflow look like? Maybe it doesn't exist. Maybe that's one of your pain points or your sources of frustration, is the fact that your municipalities simply don't communicate with you, and so you're missing addresses. That's really, really important, and we'd like to know all about that process. From a GIS perspective, there's so much to talk about here. The data availability. Do you have all of the data layers that are required for Next-Gen 911? What about the quality from a geospatial standard? What does your data look like? Is it accurate? Is it complete? Taking a look at the schema. What schema elements are you missing to make your data NG9-1-1 compliant? And then also, who is using the GIS data and how is it being used?
Andy, can I dovetail on that with just 1 second? Because I think you hit on some challenges. How many folks, and again, it's kind of hard to do with a show of hands here, but just kind of non-verbally, how many folks are thinking about that right now from the data availability perspective, right? I mean, there you go. The hands are going up. That's kind of cool. So we talk about data availability, feature classes, right? I mean, here's this 911 guy talking about feature classes, and I'll start talking about data attributes and stuff. Jeff's cracking up over there. I can see him on the camera. He's cracking up saying we've transformed this 911 guy to think about GIS stuff, right?
I count it a personal victory, Bob.
It is kind of a personal victory, right? But we use county boundaries, right? And that's a good start, So we say, what's a PSAT boundary? And, oh, it's a county boundary. Okay, cool. And then think about the next step to that is, data quality. Have you taken that PSAT boundary, your county boundary, and have you bumped it up and compared it against your neighbors? Because when we talk about NG911, you're thinking about information gathering and strategic planning to support an NG911 system. Gaps, overlaps, slithers, all those duplicates, digitized directions, things of that nature, you know, breaking your road center lines at your boundaries and jurisdiction changes. Those things that we often take for granted, we have to change. And a CAD system, you know, is a good example. You know, we think about CAD systems a lot when we talk about 911, and really in an NG9-1 environment, that's really the last piece to ever touch, you know, anything that we're working on right now. But in CAD systems, we intuitively extend our road center line sometimes 5 miles into our neighboring county. Why? Because people have medical emergencies, we have pursuits that extend into counties, and we're using AVL, and we at least want to track if they cross over in the county so we can identify where they were. That data storage and data schema, data composition changes. So that's a big change, right? And sometimes our GIS folks, you know, are going to say, but you don't need to do that because we've done it this way. And they think that why? Because us public safety folks haven't educated them on what those standards look like, right? And I'm taking the blame for everybody in public safety who's done this, right? Put it on my shoulders, that's okay. But we have to fix those issues, right? And then, you know, schema, and I don't want to talk too much about schema because I'm not really that smart. I just look like that sometimes. But in all reality, schema changes, right? I get hung up on this. Annie and I had this conversation last night, and I said, Annie, how important is it to talk about projections, right? I mean, most of the folks on here are going to probably store your data and stay plain, right? I think everybody's kind of shaking their head, say, yep. You know, how important is it that if we told you that your data for NG9-1 has to be in WGS 84? You know, we want you to hear that now while you're looking at strategic planning to figure out how you're going to accomplish that. You know, whether that's through a partner, whether that is through, you know, you maintaining, you know, different data sets, you know, but we want you to think about that now in a strategic planning effort so you can work that out, whether you know, encompassing additional staff to maintain that inside the public safety arena, whether that is, you know, figuring out a process or a tool to help you or a solution to provide that, you know, just, we want you to think about that now, right? So I kind of come off my soapbox a little bit there, but that's, you know, I started thinking about those things are changing. I'm building a budget, right? And I'm looking at strategic planning, staffing needs, all those different things. Yeah, I mean, those are critical, and just some of the things I kind of wanted to throw in there from a public safety perspective that we should not ever take for granted when asking our GIS folks to consider that as part of a strategic plan.
Yeah, and those are some really good points, Bob. And just to kind of touch on, we were talking about the boundaries just a second ago. I wanted also to challenge the GIS people out there who are still using shapefiles. Really want you to consider switching to geodatabases. A lot of people out there still use shapefiles to manage their GIS data. And while I'm a big advocate of the shapefile because it's old school and that's kind of what I grew up with, in the GIS world, for Next-Gen 911, for the topology requirements, you really need to use geodatabases and feature classes. It's so incredibly important. To kind of start moving away from that. And the other good thing is that you can also start leveraging domains. So those are some other GIS data considerations that you definitely want to look at.
Hey, Bob and Annie, we've got a couple questions here. I think they're probably good and valid questions, but would lead us down kind of a couple rabbit trails. So let's hold off to the end. I don't know exactly what your next content is, but I want to acknowledge that those are coming in, and we're gonna pile those up and answer them at the end.
Yeah, I think we can. Yeah, I think Annie, I think we can probably wrap up here in a few minutes because I'm looking at those questions.
Sure.
And I'm excited to tackle some of those.
Yeah, they're great questions. So keep them
great.
coming.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Please ask away, and we will get through this so that we have time to answer. So this is a slide that we use often, and I'm sure if you guys have been with us all week and you've been taking in all of these presentations, this is not the first time that you've seen this slide. We love this slide because it's just so accurate to the struggles of GIS people and what we have to go through with data quality. So the first question that we want to ask ourselves is, do we have the available data? Do you have all of the required layers for Next-Gen 911? And many of us do not. Many of us are still using emergency service zones or emergency service number boundaries, and have not yet made the transition to emergency service boundaries for fire law and EMS. So those are things that you want to consider is, do you have the available data? There are localities out there who don't even have address point files. So that's definitely something that you want to ask yourself is do you have all of the data layers that are available? Because if you don't really have much of a GIS, or you have someone who kind of does it part-time, this might be a staffing consideration that you might need to look at for your strategic plan. Is all of the data present? Do you have a complete data set? Are you missing big chunks of data? Do you have addresses that are missing apartment buildings, or maybe in industrial complexes and you don't have all of the information shown there? What about the schema? Is your schema accurate? So these are all things that we want to talk about as well when we're assessing the quality of our data. Does the data reflect what's in the real world? Do you have a college campus with 15 buildings and one address? And what are the implications of having missing data? What are the implications when you don't have data that lines up with what's really out there? And what does that mean for your emergency responders? Is the data available? Is it timely? How often are you updating your data? Do you have a maintenance schedule? Are you using any type of automation to kind of assist your process? These are very important, especially when we talk about provisioning data into public safety systems. You want your public safety people to be working with the most accurate and up-to-date data that you can provide to them. We also want to make sure that the data is consistent. We don't want to provision data that's missing or that doesn't match up with what's in GIS. So again, want to make sure that we're giving the most accurate and the most up-to-date data that we possibly can. So when we talk about looking at the deficiencies and the needs, you're really going to learn about this throughout your information gathering process. Certain things are going to jump off the page, especially if you're missing data sets, as we just talked about. That type of stuff is going to be very obvious. But what we like to tell people is to become very familiar with the NENA standards. That's going to guide your process. It's so incredibly important to understand what the model is asking for and what you need to have in the schema. Okay, so the other thing is, besides the data, is your overall workflows and your processes. Do you need to add in a QC process into your workflow? What is missing from your workflow? What is a pain point that you've identified? Remember early on we talked about communication and how important that is. What about your municipalities who are not sending you their data on a timely schedule? What do you do about that? So it's looking at all of these different workflows and all of the pain points and all of the areas where you're struggling and saying, okay, here's a good idea to make this go a little bit faster or to make this more efficient. And again, it does involve a certain aspect of collaboration, because you don't want to ask something that's going to be too difficult, because many municipalities, for example, I keep going back to this example because it's so appropriate. Many municipalities, they might only have one person who's in the office part-time during the week. And so you don't want to give them something that's going to be too difficult. So maybe a ticketing system may not be appropriate. Maybe it's just a routine email that they send you once every 2 weeks with maybe a list of addresses and then a map attached that shows you where those addresses are. So just identifying different things in the workflow is very important, and it helps you determine the things that you need to do to remedy what's really causing you problems. And then also legacy data. We don't want you to change your GIS data 100%. Definitely work with your public safety folks, and Bob can speak to this definitely. We don't want you deleting data that's required by CAD systems today. So make sure you're maintaining that.
Yeah, so the legacy side, and this goes back to the comments that we've seen, come in here about, CAD systems not supporting file geodatabase, and we understand that. The unfortunate thing is, and talk about that in a strategic planning, conversation, is as we look at this next generation 911 transition, we're going to get there. And we've had a number of folks ask us, at conversations and presentations, when's NG9-1 coming? I wish I had an answer for you, but I'll say we're starting to see some rapid change and development now. We had a conversation earlier in the week with Natalie Duran, the Florida TURC coordinator, about how NG9-1 would help us respond to the COVID crisis from a PSAP perspective, right? I mean, so we're gonna get there, and it's gonna be a transition. But while we get there, we have to maintain those legacy data sets. So MSAG, ALI, those of us in the public safety realm have been told that our MSAG is going to go away, our ALI is going to go away, and we're going to move to this new thing called LVF, ECRF, and a LIS. But when are they coming, right? They're coming several years from now, so we're going to have all these transitional elements, and maintaining that database now is going to be a challenge. So from the strategic planning perspective, if you have to maintain these pieces, especially in a GIS perspective, you have to maintain these processes and dual processes. Can you do that with your existing staff, right? Or do you need somebody else to help maintain that? Is it a part-time person? Is it, can somebody in public safety kind of be moved over to do that? What does all that look like? And that's why we talk about that now from a strategic plan perspective. I know a lot of you on this call right now are probably, in the height of budget season. What does that look like? So, just keep that consideration in the back of your mind that, unfortunately, for a period of time, and even once we deploy to NG9-1, we're going to have to maintain these duplicate data sets for a little while. There's kind of a redundancy, unfortunately.
Okay, so once you've gathered your information, you've identified your stakeholders, you've done your interviews, and you've documented everything, now it's time to determine what you need to do next. And I always like to tell people, go for the low-hanging fruit. Go for the things that are easy to achieve. Okay, so one thing that's easy to achieve right now that we can all do today without even being a part of any type of strategic planning process, improve your communication. What we talked about earlier, inviting GIS people into the PSAP or inviting PSAP folks into the GIS office, share with them how addresses are assigned, share with them how editing is done. All of this type of thing, including education, is going to help with the communication, and having that collaboration between departments, between people that have typically never worked together before in such a detailed way. Those are all very, very important things. Things that you can start with GIS. Again, taking a look at the data, determining what data layers you need to start creating today. Some of them are not as difficult as you may think. What about resolving anomalies in the data? What about areas where you have street range overlaps or areas where you have addresses that are out of order? Taking a look at that in the GIS data is easy enough just to get started. Adjusting your schema, becoming very familiar with the NINA data model for the Civic Location Data Exchange format. That's very important. What fields are you missing to make it a very granular data set that can be used in public safety? And then a maintenance schedule. If you don't have a maintenance schedule established or a QC process established, this is the time to start looking at that. What about documentation? How many people have SOPs hashed out for all of their different procedures and processes? What about addressing? If the person who assigns addressing in your locality wins the lottery and they leave, can someone else do that? We know a lot of times, especially when addressing is still in like the planning department, a lot of times the person who's doing it has that institutional knowledge. Not everything may be written down or documented, and it's very important that you get that on paper in case that person leaves, retires, again, wins the lottery. It's just very important because you don't want that person who has to take the place scrambling around trying to figure out how to assign an address. Documenting the CAD update process. What is the process for updating CAD? A lot of times it's very simple. A lot of times the vendor's involved. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you have to dump files on a server. But what does that process look like? Again, you need to consider your succession planning, and good documentation is a part of that. And then, Bob, I think you can speak to the rest of the public safety systems there and how important it is to document those.
Yeah. You know, as far as documenting, and we talked about this transitional element, right? I mean, GIS as a whole, not only in NG9-1-1, but also moving forward as we build this transitional state, we've got to support all these other business processes, right? That we're currently, and what's that impact? You know, the addressing obviously is significantly important, and what does that process look like? You know, CAD. A couple conversations here. I'm just looking at some of the questions and some of the feedback. You know, CAD systems, just quite simply, they don't support, some of them don't support file geodatabase. So what's our workaround to that? Do you have to maintain data structure in shapefile, so on and so forth? How about your call handling equipment, right? How often are you updating your call handling equipment? How often are you providing data for the mapping display systems? You know, and what does that look like now versus moving forward? You know, here's something to think about as folks continue to transition and leverage technology. Call handling systems are starting to be kind of a remote host configuration. So do you have the ability, and what is the process to update your CAD maps? You know, records management systems, predictive analytics, all of those different pieces. You know, again, as Andy indicated earlier, what if the person responsible for that, you know, suddenly retires? Who's set up for that?
So Annie.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
I was just going to say, why don't you specifically address these couple of questions about shapefiles still being relevant or necessary in some cases?
Oh, yeah. No, we're not asking you to totally abandon shapefiles. And I did see a couple of comments there where some people can't use geodatabases for whatever reason. And yes, shapefiles are definitely still relevant in a CAD environment. Sometimes shapefiles have to actually be converted into a different format that's usable by CAD. What we're specifically addressing here is the topological aspect of Next-Gen 911. So when you're building your boundaries, when you're looking at your PSAT boundary compared to your neighbors, when you're trying to build emergency service boundaries for fire, law, and EMS, when you're looking at different addressing anomalies, all of those things, you cannot use topologies in a shapefile environment. You have to use a geodatabase. So we're not asking you to totally do away with your shapefiles. You can still convert a shapefile from a geodatabase. That's totally fine. You can convert a feature class into a shapefile easily enough. It's a few clicks. But we just want you to consider, if you're not using a third-party program to validate your GIS data, you want to make sure that you are operating in an environment that supports topology, and that would be by using a geodatabase.
And I would add to that, Annie, that descending into these types of particulars are exactly where the value in strategic planning lies. Because it's not, the things that we're sharing with you this week and this presentation and others are generic. They're saying, as a general use case, here's a good purposeful order, or here are the data quality issues you should begin to consider it broadly. These are the succession planning and training things you need to think about. But a solid strategic plan looks at what are the current state, the descend into the particulars of your technical systems, your data systems, and your business process workflows that will bring the right answer and recommendation for you, not for some generic sort of thought, but exactly your situation and what's right for you.
Yeah, it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all. I mean, there's so many facets to preparing workflows and GIS data for next-gen. Really, it's endless. Did you have any other questions about the data part of it?
There are a couple more questions. I don't know if you have more content here, or we should dive into the other questions.
Well, to me, it's pretty self-explanatory. We want to make sure that if your staff requires training, that you write that into your plan, especially succession planning, like we talked about a little bit ago. You definitely always want someone to back up in case the primary is not available. You also want to make sure that you have more than one GIS or addressing authority person trained in that process, because you have to keep the work moving and you have to keep the data updated regardless if someone's on maternity leave or vacation or whatever. So you want to keep that workflow moving. And then also staffing. This is honestly the time to have some very real conversations within your organization. If you're overwhelmed, if you don't feel like your existing staff is up to the task of managing that data or taking care of all of what's required for NextGen, then this is the time to have that conversation and say, okay, we need to add an additional person in public safety who is specifically focused on public safety GIS. So that's a big one there, is staffing.
I think to that also, to kind of circle back on the question earlier, that's your succession planning, right? I mean, you have got to consider that during your staffing conversations is succession planning. You know, especially in a government entity, there's going to be folks that are not a fan. But if you have a retirement coming up of a critical staff or any staff, you know, do you have the relationship to leverage the trust from your directors and administrators to say, you know, Annie's retiring in 6 months, so I need to hire somebody now. Yeah. I need to hire somebody now because there has to be a transfer knowledge period, you know, to support these critical systems. So all of that should go into some of your strategic planning sessions. I just had a conversation the other day with one of our partners that said, "Hey, I'm retiring in a year," and I was encouraged to hear that that her replacement is being hired in the first quarter of 2021. You know, to give her that opportunity to get there. Or I'm sorry, the last quarter of 2020, so she has a 6-month time window to get spun up. So that was encouraging. Yeah, anonymous, you know, layoffs due to COVID-19.
Yeah, you can't plan for that kind of succession.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Are you ready for more questions? We got 2 more.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Go for it.
Aaron says, can either of you give a personal example of how you or municipal GIS staff have helped launch and conduct a needs assessment or gap analysis to get the proper strategy implemented? Case example, in other words?
Yeah, I mean, any of our clients who use us for strategic planning services would be a good case study. I'm trying to think of who the best one would be, Bob.
I've got one that comes to mind, and you know, really being initiated out of the GIS staff is, and I not having spoken to them directly, you know, prior to and using the name, you know, there was a county here in Florida, and I'll call it Northwest Florida, that an implementation, a gap analysis, the process started from the GIS personnel. It did not come out of 911. I will say that the first conversation we had came from the public safety GIS administrator, who said, we've got to do this thing. We've got to figure this thing out. And I've talked to 911 already and they're on board. So let's take a big deep dive in here and see what we can do. That project, you know, or that county is well underway with what they're doing. We're proud to be stepping through that with them. But that's an example where GIS kind of took the bull by the horns and said, we're going to do this thing, and we're off and running, and they're going to do wonderful things there. And they're going to do wonderful things because they had the conversation ahead of time. They opened the door. Everybody's on the same page, and they're really the driving force behind that. And the biggest thing to that is they were not afraid, and continue not to be afraid to kind of open Pandora's box per se, and recognize that they have some challenges ahead of them.
All right, well, it's a minute over here, so we're going to go ahead and conclude that. There's a couple questions that we didn't get to. We do have the ability to send out some notes with our recordings, so we'll look at those and see if we can give some insight to those in those notes. So we really appreciate you guys joining us today. And Annie, Bob, anything you want to say on the way out?
No, just we're here for you if you need us.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for their time. You know, Kim, I see your message there. I'll reach out to you. and try and answer that. And Andy and I reach out to you and answer that directly with you. But, you know, more importantly, thank each of you for what you're doing to support, you know, not only the public safety aspect, but, you know, supporting everybody else, especially in this very difficult time. We haven't thrown it up yet, but, you know, look at all these different COVID-19 responses and data collection. Folks, that's the work that you're doing every day. I'm not sure if anybody's reached in and thanked you for that, but without the work that you folks are doing in GIS and public safety, there'd be absolutely no way that we can continue to fight this battle. So thank you all so much. We appreciate it. It's an absolute honor to be in the same room as so many GIS practitioners.
Hey, Annie, do you want to
Thank you,
show
guys.
your last slide there in case anybody wants to get your email address?
Oh, yeah. Oh, wait, we don't have one.
You don't have it. Just kidding. All right.
We
Thanks,
missed
everybody.
that
We're
one,
going to go ahead
Bob.
and close it out.
We'll get it out.
Have a great
to you.
weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks all.